Elena Rodriguez had been dead for 11 years, at least according to her Navy service record. The official report listed her as K.I.A. Eastern Europe training exercise. Mechanical failure. But ghosts don't restore vintage aircraft in remote Wyoming hangars, and they certainly don't monitor encrypted military frequencies on quiet Tuesday mornings. At 43, Elena looked nothing like the decorated lieutenant commander who'd once flown impossible missions behind enemy lines. Her calloused hands spoke of years working with wrenches instead of flight controls, her weathered face telling stories of mountain winters rather than cockpit hours. The locals in Riverton knew her as the best aircraft mechanic within 300 miles. A woman who could resurrect any broken plane and preferred cash payments to credit cards. What they didn't know was that Elena Rodriguez had once been called by a different name entirely. In classified circles, whispered among intelligence officers who'd never officially met her, she was known as Valkyrie Red. The morning everything changed started like any other. Elena was elbow-deep in the engine of a 1962 Cessna 180, her latest restoration project, when her radio crackled to life. She kept multiple frequencies open partly from old habits, mostly because the mountain silence sometimes felt too heavy. The transmission was brief, coded and sent ice through her veins. Phoenix 77 to any station. Package Charlie compromised. Request immediate dust-off. Repeat. Package Charlie compromised. Elena's wrench slipped, scraping her knuckles against the engine block. Package Charlie. That code name hadn't been used in over a decade, not since. Admiral Mason's investigation had been buried so deep it might as well have been cremated. She grabbed a rag, wiping blood from her hand while her mind raced through possibilities. Admiral Mason was dead, had been for 6 months now, a quiet heart attack that surprised no one who knew the stress he'd carried. But before his death, he'd left Elena something. A sealed package with specific instructions. Open only if Phoenix 77 goes active again. The package sat in her safe, untouched since the funeral. She'd assumed it would stay there forever, another relic of a life she'd deliberately left behind. But as she listened to the radio chatter that followed military units scrambling, aircraft being redirected, someone very powerful trying to contain something, Elena realized Admiral Mason had known this day would come. By noon, the radio traffic had escalated dramatically. More coded transmissions, references to surveillance assets being reactivated, and mentions of congressional oversight being temporarily suspended. Elena recognized the patterns from her intelligence days. Someone was running an unauthorized operation, and they were doing it fast before anyone could ask questions. She climbed down from the Cessna and walked to her safe, hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The package was exactly where she'd left it, bearing Admiral Mason's unmistakable handwriting. For Elena, when justice needs wings again. Inside was a data drive, a set of coordinates, and a letter that made her stomach drop. The illegal surveillance network they'd discovered 11 years ago, the one that had cost Elena her career and forced her into exile, hadn't been dismantled after all. It had been waiting dormant for the right political climate to reactivate. Admiral Mason's letter was brief but devastating. They buried your evidence, Elena, but they never destroyed the program. New administration, same criminals, bigger ambitions. The surveillance network is going online within 48 hours. Congressional oversight has been compromised. The only person who can stop this is someone who's already sacrificed everything, someone who has nothing left to lose. Elena read the letter twice before the full implications hit her. The people who destroyed her career classified her discoveries as unauthorized intelligence and forced her into hiding were back in power. And this time, they weren't just running surveillance on foreign targets. They were targeting American citizens. The coordinates pointed to Washington, D.C., to a private airfield used for Congressional transportation. Admiral Mason had arranged for someone on the Senate Oversight Committee to receive the evidence, but only if it could be delivered personally by someone beyond the reach of the compromised intelligence apparatus. Someone like Valkyrie Red. Elena walked back to her restored Cessna, running her hands along its pristine fuselage. She'd spent 3 years bringing this aircraft back to life, stripping away decades of neglect to reveal the beauty underneath. It had no modern avionics, no GPS transponder, no digital systems that could be tracked or monitored. It was, she realized, the perfect ghost plane for a pilot who'd been officially dead for 11 years. As she began pre-flight preparations, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in over a decade: purpose. Not the hollow satisfaction of fixing broken engines, but the razor-sharp focus of a mission that mattered. Democracy itself was under threat, and she was possibly the only person positioned to stop it. The irony wasn't lost on her. They'd tried to bury Elena Rodriguez so thoroughly that she'd become invisible to their surveillance systems. But invisibility, she was about to remind them, was exactly what made Valkyrie Red so dangerous. As her engine warmed up, Elena keyed her radio one final time to monitor the continuing military chatter. Within hours, she'd either complete the most important mission of her career or die trying. But after 11 years of exile, of watching from the sidelines while the country she'd served was slowly corrupted from within, death seemed like an acceptable alternative to silence. Valkyrie Red was about to fly again, and this time, the mission would determine whether truth or power would ultimately prevail. Elena's Cessna lifted off from her private strip at exactly 12:30 p.m., climbing steadily into the clear Wyoming sky. She'd filed no flight plan, contacted no control towers, and left no trace of her departure except tire tracks on gravel. For the first time in 11 years, she was flying with purpose beyond mere transportation. The coordinates Admiral Mason had provided would take her directly through some of the most restricted airspace in the continental United States. It was a route designed to trigger every alarm system from NORAD to Nellis Air Force Base, and that was exactly the point. She needed to activate protocols that had been dormant since her exile, clearance codes that existed at classification levels above normal military command. As she flew east, Elena monitored multiple radio frequencies, listening to the ongoing military exercise that wasn't really an exercise at all. The surveillance network reactivation was proceeding ahead of schedule, with assets being positioned for domestic monitoring under the cover of counter-terrorism training. It was brilliant in its brazenness, hiding illegal surveillance of American citizens behind legitimate national security operations. 2 hours into her flight, Elena crossed into Nevada airspace. Almost immediately, her radio crackled with the voice she'd been expecting. Unidentified aircraft bearing 270. You are entering restricted military airspace. Identify yourself immediately and alter course to heading 0-9-0. Elena didn't respond. She maintained her heading, flying straight toward the most sensitive military installation in the region. Behind her, she knew, fighter jets were already scrambling from Nellis Air Force Base. Standard protocol for unidentified aircraft in restricted zones called for immediate intercept, with escalation to weapons-free if the target failed to comply. Unidentified Cessna, this is Nellis Control. You are ordered to change course immediately. Military aircraft are en route to intercept. Comply now or face forced landing. Still no response from Elena. She could see the F-16s now, 2 silver. Specks growing rapidly larger in her mirrors. They moved into standard intimidation formation, close enough to be unmistakably visible, far enough to avoid collision if she made any sudden maneuvers. The lead pilot was undoubtedly preparing to fire warning shots, standard procedure for non-compliant aircraft. Elena waited until the fighters were perfectly positioned, their pilots no doubt frustrated by her apparent inability to understand the mortal danger she was in. Then she keyed her microphone and spoke the words that would change everything. Control, this is Valkyrie Red. Mission Echo Zulu in progress. Confirm handshake protocol. The effect was immediate and dramatic. For 5 full seconds, every radio frequency went completely silent. Elena could picture the chaos erupting in control towers across the country as that codename triggered alerts in systems that hadn't been activated in over a decade. The phrase Valkyrie Red automatically opened a classified file with Tier 0 security clearance higher than most generals possessed, accessible to fewer than 12 people nationwide. The handshake protocol was Admiral Mason's failsafe, a system he built into multiple classified networks to protect his most valuable asset even after his death. Eagle 1, this is Control. Break formation immediately. Do not pursue. Repeat, break formation and return to base. Mission classified. Elena watched in her mirrors as the F-16S peeled away, their pilots undoubtedly stunned by the sudden stand-down. Order. She could imagine their confusion. They'd never received orders to ignore a restricted airspace violation, never encountered a civilian aircraft with that level of clearance. In the control tower at Nellis, Colonel Marcus Webb stood staring at his communication screens in disbelief. He'd been in military aviation for 23 years and had never heard a stand-down order that absolute. His communications officer, Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes, looked equally bewildered. "Sir, should I file an incident report?" she asked. "With what details?" Webb replied grimly. "A woman in a Cessna just used a code word that superseded our operational authority. Half the computers in this building are showing classification levels I've never seen before, and I'm being told to forget this intercept ever happened." Webb pulled up what files he could access about Valkyrie Red, but most were sealed beyond his clearance level. What little he could see painted a picture of a pilot who'd completed missions others considered impossible, someone who'd operated in the deepest shadows of military intelligence. "Sir," Lieutenant Hayes said quietly, "according to the service records I can access, Valkyrie Red has been listed as Kier for 11 years. "Well, Lieutenant," Webb replied, watching the small aircraft disappear on his radar screen. "Either way, just saw a ghost, or someone's been keeping very important secrets." Meanwhile, Elena climbed to cruising altitude, finally allowing herself a moment of relief. The clearance codes had worked exactly as Admiral Mason had promised. She was now officially invisible to military interference, protected by security classifications that existed outside normal command structures. But she also knew that her radio transmission had triggered alerts in Washington, D.C. The same people who'd buried her investigation 11 years ago would soon know that Valkyrie Red was operational again. They'd realized that someone had Admiral Mason's evidence, and they'd move heaven and earth to stop her from reaching her destination. Elena checked her navigation systems and fuel levels. 2 hours to Washington, D.C. 2 hours to deliver evidence. That would end careers and potentially save American democracy. The hardest part wasn't the flying. It was the certainty that someone would be waiting for her when she landed. As she flew over the Colorado Rockies, Elena reflected on the irony of her situation. They'd tried to erase Elena Rodriguez so completely that she'd become a ghost. But ghosts, she was about to remind them, were notoriously difficult to kill twice. In a windowless conference room buried 3 levels beneath the Russell Senate office building, Deputy Director Marcus Kane was having the worst day of his career. The secure phone on a mahogany table had been ringing non-stop for the past hour, each call bringing worse news than the last. "Sir, we have confirmation," his aide, James Patterson, said as he hung up the encrypted line. "Valkyrie Red is operational." The Nellis intercept was called off using Admiral Mason's old protocols. Kane, a thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and calculating eyes, slammed his palm against the table. He'd spent 11 years climbing the intelligence hierarchy, carefully positioning himself to reactivate the surveillance network that Admiral Mason had tried to destroy. Everything had been perfect. New administration, sympathetic oversight committee, enough national security fears to justify expanded domestic monitoring. That's impossible, Kane snapped. Elena Rodriguez has been dead for 11 years. I saw the reports myself. Apparently not, sir. And there's more. Patterson consulted his tablet nervously. She's carrying Mason's evidence. The same files we thought were destroyed when his investigation was terminated. Kane felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The surveillance network, codenamed Project Cerberus, was scheduled to go fully operational in 18 hours. It would give them unprecedented access to civilian communications, social media, financial records, and location data for every American citizen, all under the legal cover of counterterrorism legislation that Congress had passed without reading the fine print. But if Elena Rodriguez reached the Senate Oversight Committee with Mason's evidence, everything would collapse. Cerberus would be exposed. Congressional hearings would follow, and Kane's entire network of co-conspirators would face federal prosecution. Where is she now? Kane demanded. Over Colorado, maintaining course for Washington, D.C. She's using an untrackable aircraft, no transponder, no GPS, no digital signatures. Our satellite surveillance can follow her visually, but we can't interfere with her flight electronically. Kane stood and walked to the wall display showing a map of the United States. A red dot marked Elena's current position, moving steadily eastward. In 18 hours, that dot would either land at a private airfield outside Washington, D.C., or it would disappear permanently. Activate the contingency protocols, Kane ordered. I want every asset we have working this problem. She cannot be allowed to reach her destination. Patterson looked uncomfortable. Sir, her clearance codes are still active. Any military intervention will trigger questions we can't answer. Admiral Mason built multiple failsafes into the system. Admiral Mason is dead, Kane interrupted coldly. And his failsafes won't protect the dead pilot forever. 200 miles away, at a small regional airport in Kansas, another piece of Kane's network was activating. Airport manager Robert Hayes received a call that would have seemed routine to anyone listening, a request to ground all civilian aircraft due to a temporary air traffic control malfunction. But Hayes knew better. He'd been recruited 5 years ago, when his gambling debts made him vulnerable to Kane's influence. Since then, he provided information about unusual aircraft movements, delayed certain flights, and occasionally arranged for mechanical problems to ground aircraft whose passengers asked too many questions. The woman flying the unmarked Cessna represented the greatest threat to Project Cerberus, and Hayes had been given specific instructions: delay her by any means necessary. As Elena approached Kansas airspace, Hayes activated false weather warnings, hoping to force her to land for fuel and maintenance. But the woman who'd once flown through enemy territory without backup wasn't deterred by reports of severe turbulence. Ahead, in her cockpit, Elena monitored multiple radio frequencies, noting the unusual coordination between various air traffic control centers. Someone was trying very hard to track her flight without making it obvious. She recognized the patterns from her intelligence days, a surveillance network closing in, trying to predict her movements without revealing their own involvement. But Elena had advantages her pursuers didn't fully understand. She'd spent 11 years studying their methods, learning their protocols, understanding how power operated in the shadows. More importantly, she'd learned to think like her enemies, to anticipate their moves before they made them. She also had Admiral Mason's final gift, not just the evidence that would expose Project Cerberus, but a complete map of everyone involved in the network. Names, financial records, communication logs, and operational details for every person who'd helped bury her investigation 11 years ago. As she flew over Missouri, Elena opened the encrypted files on her tablet, reviewing the scope of the conspiracy she was about to expose. It was worse than she'd imagined, not just illegal surveillance, but active manipulation of intelligence reports, suppression of congressional oversight, and coordination with private contractors who'd been granted extraordinary access to government surveillance systems. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely damning. If it reached the right people, it would trigger the largest intelligence scandal in American history. Behind her, Elena noticed two aircraft that had been maintaining the same relative position for over an hour. Not close enough to be obvious, but too consistent to be coincidental. Her pursuers were getting desperate, which made them dangerous. She changed course slightly, testing their reaction. Both aircraft adjusted their headings accordingly, confirming her suspicions. Someone was tracking her visually, probably using private aircraft to avoid triggering the military protocols that protected her from official interference. Elena smiled grimly and pushed her throttle forward. They wanted to track Valkyrie Red? Let them try to keep up with a pilot who'd once outflown surface-to-air missiles over Eastern Europe. The final approach to Washington, D.C. would be the most dangerous part of her mission. Kane and his network would throw everything they had at stopping her. But Elena had spent 11 years preparing for this moment, and she had no intention of failing when the stakes were highest. Democracy itself was hanging in the balance, and Valkyrie Red was carrying the only evidence that could tip the scales toward justice. Elena's approach to the Washington, D.C. area began at dawn, her Cessna cutting through morning mist as the nation's capital sprawled beneath her. She'd been flying for 8 hours straight, pushing both herself and her aircraft to their limits while dodging increasingly aggressive surveillance attempts. The evidence tablet secured in her flight bag contained enough classified information to bring down a dozen high-ranking officials, but getting it to the right hands was proving more dangerous than any combat mission she'd ever flown. At Joint Base Andrews, Colonel David Martinez was having an argument that would define his career. The secure phone in his office carried the voice of Deputy Director Kane, whose tone had grown increasingly threatening over the past hour. "Colonel, this is a matter of national security," Kane insisted. "That aircraft contains stolen classified materials. You have full authority to force it down." Martinez, a career officer with 26 years of service, knew something wasn't right. The woman flying the Cessna had clearance codes that superseded his operational authority, yet Kane was demanding he violate direct orders from higher command. "Sir, with respect, Valkyrie Red's clearance is still active. Any interference with her flight would require authorization from me," Kane interrupted. "I'm giving you that authorization now." But Martinez had already checked the classification levels involved. Kane didn't have authority over Tier 0 operations, and trying to override them would trigger automatic reviews by congressional oversight committees. Unless, of course, those committees have been compromised. "I need written orders, sir, through proper channels." The phone went dead, leaving Martinez staring at his communications equipment. In 30 minutes, the mystery pilot would enter restricted airspace around the capital. He had to make a decision that would either save his career or end it. Meanwhile, Elena was monitoring emergency frequencies when she heard something that chilled her blood. Civilian aircraft in the area were being redirected due to a training exercise that would clear the airspace around her destination. Kane's network was preparing to isolate her, removing witnesses to whatever they planned to do next. The private airfield Admiral Mason had designated was just 20 miles ahead, but Elena could see aircraft positioning themselves to intercept her approach. Not military jets, those were still bound by her clearance codes, but unmarked civilian aircraft that could claim mechanical problems or navigation errors if questioned later. Elena keyed her radio to the emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is civilian aircraft November 74 Delta requesting immediate priority landing at Reagan National. Declaring fuel emergency. The response was immediate. November 74 Delta. Reagan National is closed for security exercises. Divert to BWI or Dulles. Negative. Fuel critical. Requesting emergency services standing by. Elena wasn't actually low on fuel, but the emergency declaration would create radio traffic and official logs that Kane's people couldn't easily suppress. More importantly, it would bring her into controlled airspace where civilian air traffic. Controllers, people outside Kane's network, would have oversight of her landing. As she changed course toward Reagan National, Elena noticed the unmarked aircraft falling back. They couldn't risk a public incident at a major airport, not when emergency protocols would automatically record everything. But Kane had one final card to play. At a private security company office in Arlington, former Navy SEAL Commander Jake Morrison received a call that activated protocols he'd hoped never to use. Morrison ran a legitimate defense contracting business, but he also maintained a small team of operators who handled problems that couldn't be solved through official channels. The package is landing at Reagan National in 15 minutes. Kane's voice was tight with desperation. She cannot be allowed to leave that airport with the material she's carrying. Morrison understood the implications. This wasn't about national security. It was about protecting a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. But he also understood that refusing Kane would mean the end of his company's lucrative defense contracts. What level of intervention are we authorized for? Morrison asked carefully. Whatever is necessary. The material she's carrying could destabilize the entire intelligence apparatus. Morrison hung up and activated his team. They had vehicles strategically positioned around Reagan National, communications equipment that could monitor airport security frequencies, and enough firepower to handle a situation that had already gone far beyond legal boundaries. Elena touched down at Reagan National at 7:23 a.m., her Cessna's wheels smoking slightly from the hard landing. As she taxied toward the general aviation terminal, she could see unmarked vehicles moving into position around the airport perimeter. Airport security approached her aircraft immediately, not unusual for an unscheduled emergency landing. But Elena noticed they were asking questions about her cargo rather than her fuel situation. Someone had gotten to them first, priming them to detain her for additional screening. "Ma'am, we need to inspect your aircraft for security purposes," the lead security officer explained apologetically. Standard procedure for emergency landings. Elena smiled and handed over her identification, not the fake Wyoming driver's license she'd been using for 11 years, but her original military ID, still valid despite her official death. The security officer's expression changed immediately when he saw her rank and security clearance. "Lieutenant Commander, I apologize for the delay. We weren't informed of your classification level." "No problem," Elena replied calmly. "I need secure transportation to the Russell Senate office building immediately. Official business." As the security officer made arrangements, Elena spotted Morrison's team positioning themselves at the terminal exits. Professional operators, moving with the casual precision that marked them as former special forces. They were trying to look like travelers, but Elena had learned to recognize predators during her intelligence years. The tablet containing Admiral Mason's evidence was still in her flight bag, along with backup copies hidden throughout her aircraft. But getting past Morrison's team would require the kind of tactical thinking that had kept her alive during 47 classified missions. Elena had come too far to be stopped by hired guns in an airport terminal. The evidence that could save American democracy was less than 5 miles from its destination, and she had no intention of letting Kane's conspiracy succeed. Valkyrie Red had landed, but the most dangerous part of her mission was just beginning. Inside Reagan National Airport's General Aviation Terminal, Elena assessed her situation with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through decades of covert operations. Morrison's team had positioned themselves at every exit, disguised as travelers but moving with military precision that marked them as professionals. She had 3 advantages. They didn't know she'd identified them. They couldn't risk a public confrontation in a federal airport, and she still carried clearance codes that most security personnel would respect without question. Elena approached the airport security supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Captain Dorothy Williams, whose bearing suggested military background. "Captain, I need to speak with you privately about a security concern," Elena said, showing her military identification again. Williams led her to a private office, where Elena produced a sealed letter Admiral Mason had included with her mission materials. It was addressed to any federal security officer who might need verification of her authority. "Captain, I'm conducting a classified investigation involving potential terrorist infiltration of federal facilities. I have reason to believe several individuals in your terminal are conducting surveillance on my activities." Williams read the letter, her expression growing increasingly serious. Admiral Mason's signature and official seals were unmistakable, and the security protocols outlined in the document were well beyond anything a civilian could fabricate. "What do you need, Commander?" "Discreet surveillance of the individuals. I'll identify and secure transportation to the Russell Senate building. This cannot go through normal channels. There's evidence of compromise at multiple levels." Elena pointed out Morrison's team through the security office window, noting their positions and coordination patterns. Williams activated her security cameras, documenting their presence and movements. "Commander, those men aren't on the authorized personnel lists. They entered the terminal separately, but they're clearly coordinating activities. That's a federal crime in an airport." Elena nodded grimly. "They're here to prevent me from delivering evidence of a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. The materials I'm carrying could prevent a constitutional crisis." Williams made a decision that would later save her career and possibly her life. Instead of waiting for official authorization, she activated airport emergency protocols that would complicate any attempt to interfere with Elena's movements. Meanwhile, Morrison's team was growing impatient. Their communications equipment was monitoring airport security frequencies, and they could hear increased chatter about unauthorized personnel in the terminal. Kane's voice crackled through their earpieces, demanding status updates. "She's been in that security office for 20 minutes, Morrison reported. "If she's compromised our positions, this whole operation is blown." "Then end it now," Kane replied coldly. "Create a distraction, extract the materials, and disappear. We'll handle the cleanup." But Morrison hesitated. His team were professionals, not assassins. They'd signed up to intimidate witnesses and retrieve stolen documents, not to conduct combat operations in a federal airport. The mission was escalating beyond their comfort zone. Elena emerged from the security office, accompanied by 2 federal air marshals who'd been quietly briefed on the situation. Captain Williams had activated mutual aid protocols with other federal agencies, creating a security bubble around Elena that Kane's team couldn't penetrate without triggering massive official responses. As they moved toward the secure exit, Morrison made his decision. Instead of confronting Elena directly, he activated a backup plan that Kane had hoped to avoid direct political pressure. Within minutes, Senator Richard Hayes, chairman of the Intelligence Oversight Committee, received a call that would test his loyalty to the Constitution against his career ambitions. "Senator, this is Deputy Director Kane. We have a rogue operative." attempting to deliver fabricated intelligence to undermine ongoing national security operations. She's claiming to have evidence from Admiral Mason's investigation, but we know that material was classified and destroyed years ago. Hayes, who'd been carefully cultivated by Kane's network for the past 2 years, faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could either support Elena's mission to expose the truth, or help Kane suppress evidence that would destroy careers and end his own political advancement. "What do you need from me?" Hayes asked, his voice revealing the decision he'd already made. "She's requesting a meeting with your oversight committee. Deny the request, cite security concerns, and have her detained for psychiatric evaluation. We'll handle the rest." But Hayes had underestimated the scope of Admiral Mason's preparations. The evidence Elena carried included detailed records of every conversation Kane had conducted with compromised officials, including recordings of Hayes accepting illegal campaign contributions in exchange for favorable oversight decisions. Elena's secure phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Senator Hayes has been compromised. Proceed to backup location. Someone you can trust is waiting." Admiral Mason's failsafes were still protecting her, even from beyond the grave. His network of loyal contacts was activating, creating alternative paths to deliver the evidence when primary channels were blocked. Elena changed direction, following the air marshals toward a different exit where an unmarked federal vehicle was waiting. Morrison's team scrambled to adjust their positions, but the airport security net was closing around them. "Captain Williams." Voice echoed through the terminal. "Security alert. All unauthorized personnel report to nearest security checkpoint immediately. This is not a drill." Elena reached the secure vehicle and climbed in, finally allowing herself a moment of relief. The evidence was still safe, and she was moving toward people who could act on it. But she also knew that Kane's desperation would only increase as his options decreased. The final phase of her mission would be the most dangerous, because cornered conspirators were capable of anything to protect their secrets. Elena had exposed the network, but now she had to survive long enough to see justice served. The secure conference room in the Russell Sand office. The building had been swept for surveillance devices 3 times in the past hour. Senator Patricia Coleman, the ranking minority member of the Intelligence Oversight Committee, reviewed Elena's evidence with growing horror, while FBI Deputy Director Thomas Anderson documented each revelation. "This is worse than Watergate," Coleman whispered, scrolling through financial records that showed illegal surveillance contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They'd been building a domestic spy network using counterterrorism legislation as cover. Elena sat calmly across the conference table, her mission bag containing additional evidence that would implicate dozens of officials. Admiral Mason's investigation had been thorough. Every illegal transaction, every compromised official, every violation of constitutional rights was documented with overwhelming precision. "Senator, we need to move quickly," Anderson warned. "My sources indicate that Director Kane is preparing to claim these documents are fabricated. He's already convinced Senator Hayes to call for Commander Rodriguez's arrest on espionage charges." Coleman looked at Elena with new respect. "You've been carrying this evidence for how long?" 11 years, ma'am. Admiral Mason sealed it after his investigation was terminated. He knew they'd try to reactivate the surveillance network eventually. The evidence was devastating in its scope. Project Cerberus wasn't just about monitoring communications. It included artificial intelligence systems designed to predict and influence civilian behavior, financial algorithms that could manipulate markets, and social media manipulation. Programs that could shape public opinion on any topic. "They've been testing it on smaller scales," Elena explained, pulling up operational reports. "Social media campaigns to influence local elections, financial pressure on journalists who investigated." intelligence operations, targeted harassment of whistleblowers and their families. Anderson studied personnel files that showed the full extent of the conspiracy. Half the senior staff at 3 major intelligence agencies are involved. This isn't rogue operations, this is systematic corruption of the entire oversight apparatus. Senator Coleman made the decision that would define her career. We're calling emergency hearings. Full committee, closed session, tomorrow morning. And we're issuing subpoenas to night bank records, communication logs, operational files. They can't destroy evidence that's already in congressional custody. But Kane's network wasn't finished fighting, as Elena's evidence was being digitized and distributed to trusted committee staff. Deputy Director Kane was activating his final contingency plan. In a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., private contractors were preparing to implement what Kane called operational damage control. If they couldn't suppress the evidence, they would discredit it by claiming it was part of a foreign disinformation campaign. Activate the deepfake protocols, Kane ordered his technical team. I want Elena Rodriguez's voice print, video samples, and digital signature replicated perfectly. We're going to prove these documents were fabricated by foreign intelligence services. The technology existed artificial intelligence programs capable of creating virtually undetectable fake evidence. If they could produce convincing counterfeit versions of Elena's materials, they could claim the real evidence was part of an elaborate deception operation. But Kane had overlooked one crucial detail. Admiral Mason had anticipated this exact strategy. In the Senate committee room, Elena activated her tablet's final security protocol. Senator, Admiral Mason included authentication measures that can't be replicated by current technology. Quantum encryption signatures, biometric verification codes, and blockchain timestamps that prove these documents are genuine. She demonstrated the authentication system, showing how each piece of evidence was linked to secure servers that had been continuously monitored for 11 years. Any attempt to modify or fabricate the evidence would be immediately detectable. This is bulletproof, Anderson confirmed after reviewing the technical specifications. Even with unlimited resources, it would be impossible to create convincing counterfeits. Elena also revealed Admiral Mason's final surprise: live surveillance. Footage of Kane's team preparing their disinformation campaign. The Admiral had placed covert cameras in facilities Kane thought were secure, creating real-time evidence of obstruction of justice. He's watching them fake the evidence that's supposed to prove our evidence is fake, Elena explained with grim satisfaction. Admiral Mason was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Senator Coleman activated her secure phone, calling the FBI director personally. Director Morrison, I need immediate arrest warrants for Deputy Director Kane and 17 other individuals. We have evidence of the largest intelligence conspiracy in American history. As federal agents began moving toward targets across Washington, D.C., Kane realized his network was collapsing. His technical team had been identified, his financial backing was being traced, and his political allies were abandoning him as evidence of their complicity became public. Elena's mission was nearly complete, but Kane had one final desperate option. If he couldn't suppress the evidence or discredit it, he would claim it was obtained through illegal means and demand Elena's prosecution for espionage. The battle for truth was entering its final phase, and Elena realized that exposing the conspiracy might require one last sacrifice: her own freedom to ensure justice was served. The closed session of the Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee convened at 8 a.m. sharp, with security protocols that hadn't been used since the immediate aftermath of September 11th. Every committee member had been briefed individually, their phones confiscated, and their staff cleared from the room. Senator Coleman called the hearing to order as Elena took her seat at the witness table, Admiral Mason's evidence organized in secure folders before her. Across the room, Senator Hayes looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the scope of the conspiracy he'd helped enable. This committee will now hear testimony regarding Project Cerberus and related illegal surveillance activities, Coleman announced. Commander Rodriguez, please state your qualifications for the record. Elena's voice was steady as she outlined her military service, intelligence background, and the circumstances that had led to her 11-year exile. Committee members listened with growing alarm as she detailed missions that had never appeared in official records, operations that had protected American interests while violating every oversight protocol. Admiral Mason recruited me specifically because I could operate outside normal command structures, Elena explained. My specialty was gathering intelligence that couldn't be obtained through conventional means, in situations where official military presence would create diplomatic problems. Senator Hayes tried to interrupt. Commander, you've been listed as deceased for 11 years. How do we know this testimony is reliable? Elena smiled coldly and activated her tablet, displaying classified personnel files that Hayes himself had accessed during his oversight duties. Senator, these are your own security clearance records. You've been reviewing my service record for the past 2 years, trying to determine if I posed a threat to Project Cerberus. The committee members turned to Hayes with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Elena continued her presentation, methodically destroying any pretense that Hayes had been an unwilling participant in the conspiracy. FBI Deputy Director Anderson presented the evidence his teams had gathered during overnight raids. We've arrested 14 individuals so far, including Deputy Director Kane. His facilities contained the exact surveillance equipment described in Commander Rodriguez's evidence, along with detailed plans for expanding domestic surveillance operations. Elena revealed the financial records that formed the backbone of the conspiracy. Project Cerberus had a budget of $2.3 billion over 5 years, funded through black budget allocations that were never reported to Congress. The money went to private contractors who built surveillance systems with capabilities that would make the Stasi jealous. She displayed network diagrams showing how the system could monitor every American's digital footprint in real time. Phone calls, text messages, emails, social media posts, financial transactions, location data, internet searches, everything was being collected and analyzed by artificial intelligence. Systems designed to predict and influence behavior. Senator Coleman studied the technical specifications with growing horror. This system could identify political distance, target journalists, manipulate elections, and suppress any opposition to government policies. It's the infrastructure of a totalitarian state. That was always the goal, Elena confirmed. Kane's network wasn't interested in foreign terrorism. They were building tools to control domestic political opposition. They could destroy anyone's reputation, bankrupt their businesses, or isolate them socially just by manipulating the information they received. Senator Hayes made one final attempt to save himself. Even if these allegations are true, Commander Rodriguez obtained this information through illegal means. She's a rogue operative who violated numerous federal laws. Senator Hayes, Elena interrupted, producing a tablet that made his face go pale. Would you like me to play the recording of your conversation with Kane, where you agreed to suppress Congressional oversight in exchange for campaign contributions? Or should I start with the recording where you discussed having me assassinated if I reached Washington, D.C.? The committee room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of recording. Equipment capturing every word. Elena had just revealed that sitting members of Congress had conspired to commit murder to protect an illegal surveillance network. FBI Director Anderson spoke into his secure phone. I need additional arrest teams at the Russell Building immediately. We have active participants in this conspiracy sitting in the committee room. Hayes stood abruptly, his face flushed with panic and rage. This is a setup. Kane told me she was working for foreign intelligence services, that she was trying to undermine national security by exposing illegal surveillance of American citizens. Senator Coleman's voice carried the weight of constitutional authority. Senator Hayes, you just confessed to treason on the record. Elena watched as federal agents entered the committee room to arrest Hayes. The man who'd helped authorize the surveillance of millions of Americans was led away in handcuffs, his political career ending in disgrace and federal prosecution. With Hayes removed, the committee reviewed the full scope of Admiral Mason's evidence. The surveillance network had tentacles reaching into every major intelligence agency, dozens of private contractors, and multiple congressional oversight committees. It was a systematic subversion of democratic government that had been years in the making. The good news, Elena concluded, is that Admiral Mason documented everything. Every person involved, every illegal transaction, every constitutional violation. The evidence is overwhelming and legally bulletproof. Senator Coleman made the announcement that would dominate headlines for months. This committee is recommending immediate criminal prosecution of everyone involved in Project Cerberus, complete restructuring of intelligence oversight mechanisms, and congressional hearings to determine how this conspiracy was allowed to develop. Elena felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd carried for 11 years. The mission that had cost her her career, her identity, and her freedom was finally complete. The evidence was in the hands of people who would act on it, and justice would finally be served. But as federal agents continued making arrests across Washington, D.C., Elena realized her work wasn't entirely finished. Kane's network had tentacles throughout the intelligence community, and dismantling it completely would require ongoing vigilance from people who understood how power operated in the shadows. Admiral Mason had been right about everything. Sometimes the system couldn't clean itself. Sometimes it needed outside intervention. And sometimes it needed someone who'd already sacrificed everything to ensure truth prevailed over institutional politics. 6 months after the congressional hearings that would be remembered as the largest intelligence scandal in American history, Elena Rodriguez stood in her Wyoming hangar, running her hands along the fuselage of her restored Cessna. The aircraft that had carried her on the most important mission of her career bore new scars, bullet holes from Kane's final desperate attempt to stop her, patched now but still visible reminders of how close democracy had come to falling. The aftermath had been swift and decisive. Kane and 37 co-conspirators were serving federal prison sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years. Project Cerberus was dismantled completely, its surveillance capabilities destroyed under congressional oversight. The private contractors who'd built the system lost their security clearances and government contracts. Their companies dissolved in bankruptcy and scandal. Senator Hayes died in federal custody, officially a heart attack, though some suggested the stress of facing treason charges had finally broken a man who'd sold his oath of office for political advancement. Elena felt no satisfaction in his death, only sadness that American democracy had been betrayed by someone sworn to protect it. More importantly, new oversight mechanisms were in place to prevent future abuses. Congressional intelligence committees had been restructured with genuine independence. Whistleblower protections had been strengthened significantly, and surveillance operations now required multiple layers of judicial approval. Elena's own legal status had been resolved quietly, but completely. Her military record was updated to reflect her true service. Her death certificate was officially voided, and she received a presidential commendation that would remain classified for national security reasons. She was offered reinstatement at her previous rank, lucrative consulting contracts, and positions with multiple intelligence agencies. She declined them all, preferring the quiet satisfaction of restoring vintage aircraft in the mountains of Wyoming. But Elena's phone still rang occasionally with calls from Senator Coleman, now chairing a permanent oversight committee dedicated to preventing future intelligence abuses. Sometimes, there were questions about obscure operational details from Admiral Mason's files. Sometimes there were requests for her assessment of new surveillance proposals. Always there was the implicit understanding that Valkyrie Red remained available if democracy needed defending again. Elena's restoration work had taken on new meaning since her return from Washington, D.C. Each aircraft she brought back to life represented something broken being made whole again, damaged systems being rebuilt with better safeguards, old technologies proving more reliable than modern replacements. It was therapy, but it was also preparation, maintaining skills and equipment that might be needed again someday. Local pilots still brought their aircraft to her shop, still paid in cash for work. That was consistently excellent. They didn't know about her congressional testimony, her federal commendation, or the role she'd played in protecting American democracy. To them, she was simply the best mechanic in Wyoming, a woman who understood aircraft better than anyone, and preferred working alone. But sometimes, late at night when she was working on a particularly challenging restoration, Elena would tune her radio to encrypted military frequencies and listen to traffic from operations around the world. The voices were different, the code names had changed, but the dedication remained constant. Men and women serving their country in dangerous places, often without recognition or official acknowledgement. Elena understood their sacrifice because she'd made it herself, and she found comfort in knowing that new generations of pilots were carrying on the mission of protecting freedom wherever it was threatened. 1 year after her final flight as Valkyrie Red, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Martinez, the Andrews Air Force Base commander who'd refused Kane's orders to intercept her aircraft, appeared at her hangar on a quiet Tuesday morning. "Commander Rodriguez," he said formally, then relaxed into a smile. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. My decision to follow proper protocols instead of Kane's illegal orders saved my career. But more importantly, it helped save the country." Elena wiped grease from her hands and offered him coffee. "You made the right choice, Colonel." That took courage. Not as much courage as flying solo into the most dangerous conspiracy in American history, Martinez replied. "I've read the classified reports. What you accomplished was extraordinary." They talked for an hour about military service, the challenges of maintaining ethical standards in complex situations, and the importance of individual conscience in protecting democratic institutions. When Martinez left, he carried with him Elena's quiet confidence that there were still people willing to sacrifice everything to preserve the values America represented at its best. As evening approached, Elena climbed into her Cessna for her weekly maintenance flight. She took off from her private strip and climbed into the clear Wyoming sky, flying the same route she'd flown every week for 11 years. But now it felt different, not like exile, but like freedom earned through service to something larger than herself. At precisely 12:42 p.m., Elena keyed her radio to an emergency frequency and transmitted a brief message. "Valkyrie Red. Operational status green." It was a signal that reached classified monitoring stations across the country, confirming that democracy's guardian angel remained ready to fly if needed. Then she climbed higher into the mountain sky, surrounded by peaks that had sheltered her during years of exile and now stood as silent witnesses to her vindication. The woman who'd been officially dead for 11 years was finally, truly alive again. Elena Rodriguez had completed her final mission not as Valkyrie Red, the ghost pilot who could fly anywhere undetected, but as an American citizen who'd proven that truth, courage, and individual conscience could still triumph over the most sophisticated conspiracy power could devise. In the end, that was the most important victory of all, not just exposing corruption, but demonstrating that democracy's greatest strength remained the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, when freedom itself was at stake. As she flew home through the Wyoming sky, Elena knew Admiral Mason would have been proud of how the mission ended, with justice served, democracy preserved, and one pilot finally free to choose her own flight path through whatever challenges lay ahead. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.